Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project here at the University of Washington-Tacoma. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Striketober installment of our fall seminar series. We're here tonight against a backdrop of workplace organizing and direct action, the likes of which, we haven't seen in over a generation. I think this is it's a really exciting moment. And for the first time in what feels like a very long time, power seems to be really shifting back toward the American worker. But we know that, power concedes nothing without a demand. And it feels like, for years we've been working more and more and getting increasingly less. And it feels like we're finally making that demand by saying collectively, enough is enough. And I think, COVID-19 has really initiated what's become a year and a half of disaster capitalism that's revealed some of the fundamental flaws in the way our economy has been rigged over the decades to really benefit a select few at the expense of the many. And I think, we can all agree that few corporations have profited from the pandemic as handsomely as Amazon, who, in a relatively short life has managed to infiltrate nearly every aspect of our existence. Amazon's how we shop, it's how we consume our media, it's where we get our news, it's how we store our most precious and personal information, from pictures of my kids to the data that we just kind of generate as we move through the world. I think we're so thoroughly immersed in Amazon that we rarely stop to consider, whether those luxuries come at a price. What's the real cost of all that convenience? And I think, more importantly and more pressingly, who's picking up the tab? These are precisely the questions that are explored by our guests tonight in The Cost of Free Shipping, Amazon in the Global Economy, which was an edited collection published last year by Pluto Press. And just this year, the winner of the United Association of Labor Education's Best Book Award. Congratulations, a well-deserved award, I should say. So we're joined tonight by co-editors Jake Alimahomed-Wilson and Ellen Reese, as well as contributors Jason Struna and Katie Wilson, to discuss the consequences of Amazon's rise to power, from the fulfillment center floors to the global supply chain. The Cost of Free Shipping opens by suggesting that, quote, Amazon's rise illuminates a pivotal moment in global capitalism that demands naming, interrogating, and resisting. And I think in this moment of amplified resistance, I am, absolutely honored to have this panel of experts join us tonight to discuss, not only why, but how we should push back against the Amazonification of American capitalism. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce our opening panelists. So Jake Alimahomed-Wilson is a professor of sociology at California State University, Long Beach. He's the author of Solidarity Forever, Race, Gender, and Unionism in the Ports of Southern California, and the co-author of Getting the Goods, Ports, Labor, and the Logistics Revolution. He's the co-editor of The Cost of Free Shipping, Amazon and the Global Economy, and Choke Points, Logistics Workers Disrupting the Global Supply Chain. And joining Jake will be Ellen Reese, who's a professor of sociology and the chair of labor studies at the University of California, Riverside. She's the author of Backlash Against Welfare Mothers, Past and Present, and They Say Cut Back, We Say Fight Back. She's the co-editor of Wages of Empire, Neoliberal Policies, Repression, and Women's Poverty, and of course, also co-editor of The Cost of Free Shipping, Amazon in the Global Economy. So please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for joining us this evening and sharing their expertise during this exciting moment in labor history. As always, we're going to try to set aside some time for Q&A after the presentations. But if questions arise as our presenters are talking, feel free to add them to the chat room. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alex. Shout out to all the students here. Thank you all for coming and everyone else who came to this. I'd like to thank Alex, the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies, UW-Tacoma's Labor Solidarity Project. Super grateful to be here. Also to the contributors, Katie and Jason. Folks like them made the book, I think, significant. So really happy to be here today. So today's talk, Ellen and I are going to kind of switch off. We're going to cover just like a general overview of the book. We're going to talk about for those of you who have read the book, some of the stuff in chapter 1, and then some of our substantive chapters that Ellen and I each contributed. In our conclusion, we're gonna kind of contemplate some of the global struggles against Amazon in Europe and India and across the United States, including the state of Washington, the home state of Amazon. So I'm going to pass it over to Ellen and take it away. And Ellen, can you unmute, please?
There we go. Sorry, it was not letting me do that. Sorry for that big long pause. And yeah, so this edited volume explores what we call Amazon capitalism. And by that, we're drawing attention to partly to Amazon's power in our global economy, its growing power. Amazon became the world's most valuable corporation in 2019, and its market capitalization was slightly more than the combined GDP of 9 Latin American countries combined that year. And this was prior to the pandemic when, Amazon has grown even more powerful. So Amazon's rise, right, even at that time, we argue, marked a significant shift in the global economy that we call Amazon capitalism. Now, we're not saying like it's its own economy. Like, obviously, Amazon operates within the larger global capitalist system, but it's promoted a distinct model of capitalism that other corporations mimic. And its influence is greatest, right, in the United States, where it's come out of, as well as in Europe, but it's growing quickly elsewhere, including in India, Australia, Latin America, and Africa. By 2019, Amazon also owned half of the world's public cloud infrastructure. Next. And Amazon's power and influence rose even more during the pandemic of 2020. By mid-2020, the corporation's market cap increased by $1.5 trillion, surpassing Microsoft. At that time, Jeff Bezos became the first person in the world's history to amass a net worth of over $200 billion. And Amazon's directly employed global workforce rose to over 1.3 million workers. And that's not even counting the over 500,000 contracted delivery drivers that deliver Amazon packages that are not formal employees, right, but are often subcontracted workers. Amazon's profits, we argue, depend upon racial capitalism. And here we draw on Cedric Robinson's concept of racial capitalism, highlighting how capitalism depends upon white racial domination and the exploitation of workers of color and women and immigrants and other vulnerable groups. We could just sort of look at who does what, right, within Amazon. And according to its own records, 71.4% of its top executives and senior level Amazon employees are white, mostly male. Workers of color, meanwhile, make up the bulk of its blue-collar workforce, right? So 68% of Amazon's blue-collar workers, and according to its records, it's labeling its laborers and its helpers, so it's a little beyond just warehouse workers. But 68% of these are workers of color, 33% are Black, 22% are Latinx. Next. But what do we mean by Amazon capitalism? It's not simply, we're not simply saying, hey, it's growing in influence in the sheer numbers and its, sheer power, capital and so forth, right? We're also arguing that there's certain novel aspects, right, of this distinct style of capitalism, right? And if we can talk about like Bolivian capitalism, right, or Italian capitalism, right? And Amazon is so huge, right? I think we need to analyze Amazon capitalism, which is what we try to do and our contributors do in our volume, as well as what challenges this presents for workers and communities. So Amazon's rise in power, some of its rise is not new. There's nothing new here. In fact, its rise in power just reflects larger trends that have been going on for some time, including the rising influence of finance capitalism, of neoliberal politics, and corporate power that's been underway for decades, all of which present enormous challenges for democracy, for workers and working class communities. But what we do see as distinct, right, and novel is this form of capitalism, and that's been associated with heavy use of electronic technology, right, that presents new challenges for workers, for unions, and activists, right? So we can think about the sort of one-click instant consumerism combined with what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. And Amazon has helped to promote this style of capitalism. Next. So Amazon's one-click instant consumerism, we argue, which includes the expedited free shipping of consumer products, represents a tidal shift of the global economy that's been driven largely by finance capitalism, right? Often in the short run, they were losing money, right? But as they were gaining market dominance. But they have gained market dominance, right? Monthly, about 200 million unique users, and probably it's gone up since we wrote this. Visit Amazon.com to purchase consumer products sold by Amazon. And this includes a lot of third-party sellers. It's not just Amazon selling its own goods. There's many third-party sellers, right, that are also selling their goods through Amazon.com, this retail platform that more and more people feel like they have to use in order to sell their products. And all of those deliveries going out there is having a huge environmental impact, right, contributing to the corporation's 440 million metric ton carbon footprint, and it's gone up since then, right? So Amazon's drive to deliver goods cheaply has encouraged it to become a leading logistics company. It's not just an electronic retail platform, right? But it's a leading logistics company, and Jake is going to say more about that. But the other novel feature of Amazon, it's not alone in this, but it's certainly been one of the front runners, right, in surveillance capitalism. And that term we're borrowing from Shoshana Zuboff, from that wonderful book that she wrote. And there she defines surveillance capitalism as a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. And Amazon's technologies of surveillance not only monitor every action of its blue-collar workforce in warehousing and delivery, but also its customers, us who buy its products, along with surveilling people through its Ring home surveillance system, as well as Alexa. And I'm going to now turn it over to Jake to talk more about logistics.
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, so one of the things that we argue in the book is that similar to Walmart's rise as the world's largest private corporation, largest private employer, Amazon's rise in power has to do a lot with its mastery of logistics. So, many of the chapters focus on logistics because it's been such a core function of the corporation's, rise in market dominance. So one of the, chapter 2 in the book by Kim Moody really sets, or chapter 1 actually sets a stage and looking at how logistics and Amazon's kind of drive to build the world's largest logistics infrastructure is really changing the way that we consume goods, and it has a massive impact on workers. So unlike Walmart, Amazon controls firsthand all of its warehousing facilities, distribution, fulfillment services, and there's two main groups of workers, blue-collar workers, who have been most impacted by Amazon's logistics infrastructure. So first are the warehouse workers, right? The hundreds of thousands of warehouse workers. And I learned just before this, we started here from Jason Struna that, the state of Washington is the second largest warehousing, regions in the West Coast outside of Los Angeles. And so, this is a massive footprint, right, with a massive number of workers. And the other changes that we're seeing has been the changes to what we call last mile logistics, the final leg of delivery. And delivery drivers, last year in 2020, Amazon's misclassified delivery drivers delivered 4 billion packages. That's more than FedEx. And so in just a handful of years, Amazon is seeking to undermine existing unions in this sector. And one of the chapters that I wrote, I was really interested in looking at how e-commerce and Amazon's role in logistics is really impacting the package delivery sector. And so I spent some time driving around Los Angeles with Amazon delivery drivers. And of course, these folks don't work for Amazon despite wearing Amazon uniforms, driving Amazon vans. There are what we call an arm's length relationship. Their employers are small trucking companies, right? And so one of the things that I found in kind of learning the job, in some cases delivering packages with workers, is that Amazon is driving this shift in supply chain management, right? So there's been an extension of retail supply chains away from just the brick and mortar stores like Target and Walmart, which still exist, but toward a consumer's home. And so this has created a new group of laborers that have to fill in this void, right? And this is a highly precarious group of workers who are not union, unlike UPS and US Postal, and are not paid decent wages. And so this expansion of the last mile sector then has also brought delivery warehousing back to urban centers. And so historically, these large warehousing clusters were the located of the exurbs, right? Like in the Inland Empire. But we're seeing these delivery centers based on last mile delivery pop up all in urban and suburban areas, right? And these have exploded since the pandemic. I mean, all over the United States, more of these delivery centers we are seeing. There's also been a global speed up in the movement of goods. Goods are now moved even faster. And so what we're seeing, right, the media is finally talking about supply chains. We're seeing that this just-in-time supply chain in the global economy is very fragile. At every point of the supply chain, workers are exploited, unions are attacked, and Amazon is really driving this increasing presence of speed. And we're also seeing a deeper integration of what I call anti-worker technologies of control and automation. Okay. So we cannot talk about worker exploitation and Amazon's impact on the global economy without talking about Amazon's simultaneous environmental impact, right? A tremendous carbon footprint that Amazon supply chain is directly pushing, despite its corporate greenwashing and advertisements on television and the web. Amazon is feeling the pressure from EJ activists who live around delivery centers or warehouses and has pledged to become carbon neutral. And there's also a number of Amazon employees, particularly in the tech sector, that are holding Amazon accountable. So despite increasing demand for home delivered goods, Amazon's emissions continue to rise. And I believe last year's carbon footprint was 60, that should be, was it metric tons? I can't read it. Negative impacts to workers. We could probably have a whole hour spent on this. I'm just going to give you a couple snapshots here, okay? Today's logistics and warehousing complexes are mostly located at the outskirts of, metropolitan areas and depend largely on concentrations of low-paid migrant, immigrant, and workers of color, right? So there's a racialized workforce that Ellen spoke about earlier. There's a driving down of wages and working conditions in both warehousing and last mile delivery. And there's been an increasing tax on unions. And for those of you who follow how Amazon is smashing their workers and how workers are resisting that smashing actively to today, which we will close upon today, we know that workers are resisting, right? There's been an increasing use of subcontracting and employee misclassification. And kind of drawing on, Cedric Robinson's work again, there's been a devaluation of the labor for blue collar workers of color within Amazon's logistics empire. As the concentration of wealth for mostly white male executives has exploded in the tech sector, we see that hundreds and thousands of workers of color who are disproportionately Black, brown, and immigrant workers are increasingly being spit out within this very dangerous employment system. So, other chapters in the book look at some of the conditions of warehouse workers and delivery drivers and their concerns, the middle part of the book. And we document this grueling pace of work, and some of Ellen's chapters and Jason's document this as well, with very high injury rates, right? Turnover rates among warehouse workers are extremely high. In Southern California, and behind Ellen's background is the inland port of Southern California. So Ellen works in Riverside, California, the Inland Empire, the largest warehousing nodes in the United States, one of the largest in the world, and that 90% of SoCal warehouse workers agreed they suffered from pain and fatigue by the end of their work shift, right? Working under constant surveillance, constant monitoring, and a lot of Jason's work is also really exploring this in new and dynamic ways, where delivery drivers are readily dealing with AI, right, in the delivery vans, and so these are things that are driving and degrading the work. And of course, you see the news stories of workers urinating in bottles in warehouses and also delivery vans. And last, it's really important that we want to highlight that although this is a racialized system, we have equal importance to how race and gender intersect within Amazon's global logistics empire. Ellen's chapter looks at race and gender, in particular how women of color, one of the fastest groups of blue collar workers in warehousing and increasingly in last mile delivery, where many warehouse workers have experienced or observed racism, homophobia, xenophobia, sexism, sexual harassment, and gendered job segregation, with men disproportionately doing forklift work and whatnot. And so the impact on cities, and probably no one knows this topic more on the panel than Katie Wilson, and looking forward to hearing from Katie on the impact on our local economies and cities, right? So Amazon's rising influence presents multiple complex challenges for communities. So we've talked about some of the ecological consequences, right, of this unchecked corporate dominance of our economy, right? A corporation that is known for its tax avoidance, like many Fortune 500 companies. Local businesses are suffering, right? There's been a disinvestment from the public, except for the police, right? The police have been set up and schools have been defunded, right? Local democracy, and Katie can also talk about how that went down in Seattle, right? The political voice of working class communities have been silenced, but these communities are also fighting back, right? Amazon also provides technology for the surveillance of immigrants, providing support for ICE, for the Nimbus project in Israel, and in the occupation of Palestine, and more than $4 billion worth of state and local subsidies this corporation continues to benefit from, and the use of public infrastructure. So one of my favorite chapters, if not my favorite chapter, is actually chapter 17, and it's an interview with Amazonians United, some of the workers who are organizing for worker power from the bottom up, from the shop floor. And Amazonians United chapters have cropped up across US cities. Amazon Chicagoland, who was featured in the book, previously DCH1, engages in various collective actions, including during the pandemic, walkouts, strikes, wildcat strikes, to seek and improve working conditions, including things like access to drinking water, getting full-time jobs for some members, resisting this new mega cycle shift, because that's impacting especially workers who have children, particular moms who are working these shifts, right, and the disruption of their families. Payment and health and safety improvements, and of course, COVID-related protection, right? So totally encourage folks to, if you haven't heard of Amazonians United, to check it out and donate if you can. It's a great workers movement. I'm going to turn it back over to Ellen.
Thanks, Jake. So there is this growing, sorry, it's probably glowing too. It's glowing and growing, a global resistance movement. And we argue that Amazon provides a strategic new target that could and has been inspiring activists to collaborate across cities, nations, and even social movements, including movements for economic justice, racial and social justice, anti-policing, immigrant rights, privacy and civil liberty advocacy. Anti-monopoly activists are getting involved, pro-democracy, and even environmental justice activists, right, are taking on Amazon and working together. So there's been growing community struggles, including in the Inland Empire region, where in San Bernardino, labor and community activists have been demanding more community benefits. If there's a warehouse being put in or expanded, especially around the San Bernardino airport, and demanding more protections for the community from the air pollution, the noise pollution, from more and more freight traffic coming in. And they've also been demanding recently a warehouse moratorium. And in fact, the San Bernardino City Council was like one vote shy of winning that warehouse moratorium, saying, let's have a pause on warehouses. We have too many in our community. So hasn't won yet, but it came close, and I think it'll pop back up, and the resistance is still growing. And in Fort Wayne, Indiana, meanwhile, in the Midwest, right, a city council rejected Amazon's request for an additional $7 million in tax breaks this year, right? So there's growing community resistance across the nation. And that's, this is part of a global movement, right? So we should mention that, there's, here Amazon is, successfully kept unions out, right, in the US, but they've been there for years in Europe, right? There were successful unionization drives, including of delivery drivers in Italy. There's also ongoing struggles to unionize Amazon warehouse workers in the US, right? And you may have read about what happened in Bessemer, Alabama, where Amazonian were trying to organize into a union, and Amazon was threatening them, intimidating them. The National Labor Relations Board officer recommended a second election there because it viewed Amazon's behavior as violating labor laws. So there could be another union election there in Bessemer, Alabama. And it's growing, right? The Teamsters is taking on Amazon, right? More unions, right? And it's growing. Amazonians United is continuing to grow too. And there's transnational and national links among these labor activists, both inside and outside unions. And those links are growing. They have been meeting together, collaborating, strategizing. We're going to see it again. Come this Black Friday, Cyber Monday, there's always usually some big transnationally coordinated protests, strikes that happen around that big consumer holiday time. So a great opportunity to get involved if you're interested. And if you want updates on sort of what's happening within the US, you could email this Gmail address at the bottom. And there's probably other ways to plug in locally in your local area. So I think that's it. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jason Struna, who is now an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington State. And his research focuses on transnational class formation and the labor processes that make contemporary capitalist globalization possible. And he's also currently working on his own book manuscript as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jason, to talk about chapter 5 in this edited volume.
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks to Alex and Jake and and all the other collaborators in the edited volume. I'm going to cover the volume that Ellen, or the chapter that Ellen and I produced for the volume. And I just have to clarify, I'm sharing my screen correctly. I'm not showing you my emails, right? We're good. Okay. So yeah, automation in the surveillance-driven warehouse in the inland Southern California area. So I just want to basically, I want to introduce our work and tell you a little bit about the goals of the work and the direction that this chapter took before I get into the actual specifics with it. I'll also give a little bit of an overview of our findings, just in case I need to cut things short. So we started with this exploration of automation and digital technology within Amazon warehouses. And we started to think about things in terms of generalities, similarities across geographies within the Amazon system, because we can observe them, and they are expected, since it is a massive system that's both national and global in scope. But we primarily focused on work experiences on Amazon's blue-collar warehouse workers within inland Southern California in particular. I'd actually like to reproduce this study here in the Pacific Northwest. So if anybody wants to join me in that, I would happily begin that process, and am actually beginning that process. So when we talk about inland Southern California, we're referring to Riverside and San Bernardino counties, about 60 miles east of LA, or east of the largest port complex in the United States. As of 2019, there were at least 16 Amazon facilities in the area, and I'm sure that Jake and Ellen can update this number. And they were employing approximately 14,000 workers. I have a feeling that's increased and will significantly increase, at least in the next seasonal push. In that area, the majority are Latino and Latina workers without college degrees. About 80% of workers in that region are Latino and Latina in general. I'll get into the specifics with the Amazon case in just a second. But we also, in addition to thinking about the space in Riverside and San Bernardino and the Amazon experience there, we thought of this from a particular theoretical perspective, from the work of the economist Richard Edwards, that says all systems of production require coordination. All social systems of production require coordination, but capitalist enterprises require coordination and control. And what we mean in particular by that is that we're going to engage in some sort of direction, evaluation, and discipline in the labor process. Now, those modes of control can be direct. Bosses tell you what to do, or they can be bureaucratic. There's some known or knowable set of rules and procedures. They can be machine-paced. We've all seen the Fordist sort of understanding of the assembly line. Or they can be increasingly algocratic, or the direction, evaluation, and discipline happens through algorithms and computer tracking and things like that. Amazon uses actually all of these modes of control in some way, but they're increasingly and particularly sophisticated with that latter form of algocratic or algorithmic direction. So to summarize our findings, keeping these things in mind, we find that automation and electronic surveillance of workers, and it enables Amazon to direct, evaluate, and discipline workers in specific ways, and provides useful information for the further automation of work tasks. Workers do report some satisfaction with automation, especially in workers who have worked in other kinds of facilities, say for Walmart or for small mom and pop warehousing systems where things are actually manually executed. But most informants in our study found that electronic monitoring was really, frankly, just mostly stressful, that it induced a certain kind of stress in itself. Some raised concerns about the use of technology in terms of physical health and safety, in the interviews that we conducted. But a few workers really reported immediate concerns with being replaced by automation, something that's really popular in the automation literature, concerns about technological unemployment or things like that. But some of the workers did express long-term concerns about automation that might be more concerning. And I'll get into that a little bit later here too. One of the things that we found most significantly is that workers report alienation as a major stress and as a problem that stems from the isolation and electronic control and the scale of the facilities, as well as repetitive tasks. So in thinking about this work environment in particular, alienation or loneliness and distance was one of our major findings. Another thing that we find in conclusion with the summary is that labor intensification, not just the replacement of workers by automation, but the intensification of work itself needs to be assessed specifically alongside this technological unemployment problem. So for our methods for this chapter, we interviewed 47 current and former Amazon employees in the Inland California region, with 27 explicitly focused on automation and a second wave of interviews. 44 of the 47 were blue-collar workers, and 3 were in lower-level managerial positions. Most of the interviews, and this, for those of you who are students in the audience here, most were recruited and conducted by a team of student researchers and supervised by Ellen Reese at UC Riverside. For the specific sample of our workers that we got, 67% were Latino, both reflecting the composition of labor overall. But it wasn't quite all that representative in some ways, because most of the respondents in our survey were in their 20s. So we really didn't get a lot of the older workers that you might find in an Amazon facility in general. We did all the standard sorts of things with interviews, audio recorded. We coded the themes and looked at the transcriptions and identified some of the theoretical content, as well as some of the themes that emerge on the part of what the respondents themselves identify. We also used some of my previous employment and observations as a warehouse worker in Inland California when I was a graduate student there, as well as Ellen's observations during a public tour of an Amazon facility. So we have a range of methods, primarily in this case with the interviews, but we do try to triangulate in other ways. So what are our real findings? What do we really get at here? So we'll look at the labor process in terms of technologies and tasks. What happens when you click place your order for next day delivery on Amazon Prime? And if we had a little bit more time, I think I'm going to hold off on it. I was going to show a video of Amazon fulfillment. I'll drop it in the chat in the long run here. But it's about a 2-minute video to almost 3-minute video that shows the different scanners and conveyors and robots and forklifts and all the range of stuff that people encounter in this labor process. It's really it's really noisy. It's really complicated, and it's fast paced. And I think that the video documents that. But really, when we're looking at the scanners and the ways that scanners and scanning functions, as workers report and as we observe work, they monitor these tasks, they direct these tasks, they evaluate. All of those things that we were talking about with coordination and control prior really emanate from the scanning functions in lots of ways, with pick and pack and stow and all of the different moments of that production process that goes from you clicking buy it now to the delivery to your door. Importantly, these scanners and the other kind of monitors and other computer interfaces will discipline workers in the moment where you're told you made a mistake or you need to change a process or whatever. But in the long run, these statistics about these different kinds of rates the rates of time to completion or the rates of time off task, how long you spent away from the job you're supposed to be doing, errors, all these things, all of those are accumulated and aggregated and used to discipline workers in more durable ways outside of the moment, including termination or failures to make their rate for the quotas that they have set. Now, standards for rates can vary by task, they can vary by facility. One worker in one sortation center can have a specific rate, while in another sortation center, they have a different one. But overall, it kind of averages out, and we can see that the rates, the quotas that are set up are frequently over the average of comparable functions in other corporations, other similar facilities and similar industries. The electronic surveillance issue and the pressure to make rate are ubiquitous, and they're very real across workers in the respondents that we have. 82% of respondents reported concerns about rates in general, or people who have concerns amongst their colleagues, but 75% reported personal concerns about their own ability to make rate, their own ability to maintain their job in the long run as a result of either not being able to make rate or getting close to achieving it. Workers report experiences with automation and the Amazon labor process varies. I mean, some do say, as I said earlier, that automation makes work easier. It'd be more taxing if they didn't have the automated processes. But workers also report significant safety concerns, including accidents with forklifts or conveyors, or the automated guided vehicles, the robots that move through the facilities, conveyor belts. In the video that I'll put in the chat, you can hear the ubiquitous sound a hiss of the machines, really a roar of the machines if you're on the floor there. So hearing loss is common as a reported injury. Lots of repetitive motion injuries and exertion. Now, the scale of the facilities combines with all those kinds of stresses. A large Amazon facility could be between 800,000 and 1 million square feet. For those of you in our region, they're the ones that they're talking about in Fife or on the Puyallup People's Land here, I have a feeling will be around 800,000 square feet. That's about 4 big box Walmart stores, right? Or 1 million square feet is 13 football fields, excuse me. I just saw the chat here. So the scale of these facilities, the problem of getting from your work, the place where you have to work in that facility and the restroom can really combine to make it difficult to do things like go to the restroom. You either make a choice between holding it in or making rate or peeing in the stacks. And our workers do report things like peeing in trash cans or having people pee in trash cans, having people pee on the floor in order to stay on the shop floor to make rate so they don't lose their jobs. So these create real physical and mental strains and stresses that workers report on their own, as well as in different themes that they identify as problematic within the interviews. Workers who made rates are publicly praised in stand-up meetings before each shift. Workers who don't make rates are frequently shamed publicly. They're made fun of for not being able to achieve what everybody else can achieve, even though everybody else is under stress as well. Not making rate means frequent threats, but it also could lead to actual termination. So it's a real problem. So this issue of alienation and automation, as I've said, the size of the facility, that causes problems in itself for things like going to the restroom, but it also creates issues of social interaction. Workers who scan and move stuff all day often can't interact with human beings. As a few of our respondents' quotes indicate, most of the time you're by yourself in one station, they're about 18 feet apart, right? So workers far apart from one another can't have conversations. If you're looking for a manager, you might have 5 managers in a 1 million square foot facility, and you aren't able to find them on the shop floor if you need to talk to them. I like Anna's quote here. Honestly, you can just be there and legit cry and no one would notice, or you could just hate your life and no one would notice. It was just so big and lonely sometimes. It was the most isolating feeling every single day. Although a lot of workers report that some of their tasks, things like unloading trucks, was pretty social. 2 people in the back of a truck can have a conversation. Those things remain difficult for workers who are in proximity, but because of the fears for making rate or the sounds that they hear around them, will make a conversation of any meaningful duration or quality impossible, right? Because it's just too loud and you have to focus too much to actually have a conversation. It prevents it. So I'm going to run through this a little bit. The idea of continuous improvement is something that Amazon takes very seriously. So they want to automate and scale up as much as they possibly can as part of their business model. It's stated by them. They have had some goals in terms of wanting to be a lights out facility, right? But the director of robotics at Amazon has said, that's probably 10 years away before you can have a situation where a person clicks on an order and there, few, if not 0 workers will execute that order. That is a long time away. Okay, so I do want to say before I skip to the last bit, at the time of writing, Amazon was deploying machinery in some facilities that some workers said, oh, they'll never be able to automate my task. I have to do packaging and that's too detail oriented. At the time of writing, they were actually deploying machines that could do 600 to 1,000 pieces per hour in packaging in tasks that folks thought were that were impossible for robots. Okay, so conclusion, automation and surveillance need to be understood relative to time and space at Amazon. The work rates and the scale of facility combined to require this really intensive direction evaluation and discipline system. As researchers and as citizens, we need to think as people who live in communities. Labor intensification needs to be understood as a problem that exists alongside this issue of technological employment. While that may be a thing, our research suggests that existing automation, algorithmic control, all these kinds of things makes the work that's actually going on in these places just as stressful as the future work that we worry about. Now, having said all of that, just this last month in September, a bill was introduced in California, Assembly Bill 701, and it was signed by the governor in September, just last month. It applies to warehouses and distribution centers, and it protects warehouse workers from meeting work rates that prevent compliance with meal or rest periods, use of bathroom facilities, including reasonable travel time to and from bathroom facilities, or occupational health and safety laws. So it's a bill that was introduced and passed by the legislature to protect from these kinds of algorithmic forms of direction and discipline and evaluation that make health for workers almost impossible to execute at work. So there's active work going on to scale back the reach of these kinds of things to make it possible for people to function as human beings in their jobs, not just as people executing tasks. So there are protections against employee retaliation, therefore leading to the possibility of more organizing capacity potentially. And it also makes sure that there are signals for injury rates that are 1.5 times the average for the warehouse industry as a whole. So I want to say one last bit about that issue. In the state of Washington, we actually passed rules for workers' compensation insurance that Amazon has to pay more than similarly situated warehouses and distribution centers on workers' comp because their injury rates are much higher. So California is not the only place that's changing the laws reflecting these things. Washington is starting to think about these things as well. So I do want to say, and I'll pass it off back to Ellen and Jake, I think that the bill was probably pretty clearly informed by social, scientific, and journalistic research, and the organizers on the ground, I think, had to rely on some of these things. So for those of you who think that the academic side is maybe just too much, that we just kind of take the ideas, I think sometimes these things can be used by people doing other kinds of work in other areas to actually change things on the ground for people. So don't give up on social science just yet. Okay.
Thanks so much, Jason. Really appreciate you coming through. Next, I'd like to introduce Katie Wilson. Katie Wilson is co-founder and the general secretary of the Transit Writers Union in Seattle. The Transit Writers Union is a democratic organization of working and poor people building power to fight for public transit, affordable housing, progressive taxation, and other quality of life issues in the Emerald City. The Transit Writers Union coordinated the Housing for All Coalition, which championed a big business tax that was passed and then swiftly repealed under pressure from Amazon back in 2018, which Katie documents in the book. Katie was also a member of the Progressive Revenue Task Force on Housing and Homelessness, convened by the Seattle City Council to make recommendations for the tax measure. And I will also say this, Katie is a brilliant writer. As an academic, I'm super jealous, and it was so great to work with you, Katie. Welcome.
Thank you, Jake, for that very nice introduction. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the chapter that I wrote for this book, which was a kind of a case study of a battle with Amazon over taxes that took place in Seattle, mostly in 2018. So I'm going to tell you that story briefly and also bring it up to date because quite a lot has happened since the publication of the book. I don't have a slideshow for you, so you can close your eyes and listen, or you can keep peering into my poorly lit bedroom, whatever you want. So I'll start out with just a little bit of background. Washington State, as you may know, has an extremely regressive tax system. What that means is that the poorest residents are paying the most of their income in state and local taxes, whereas the wealthiest residents are paying very little. I believe it's something like 18% of your income if you're in the bottom 20% income bracket, you're paying in state and local taxes, whereas if you're in the top 1%, you're paying like 3%. So it's a really big difference. Now that's good for wealthy people. It's good for tech workers. It's good for tech CEOs like Jeff Bezos. And in the Seattle area, we have a lot of tech wealth. And in particular, we have Amazon. So over the last 25 years or so, Amazon has grown to just mammoth proportions in the Seattle area. They have over 50,000 employees, I believe, now in the Seattle city limits alone. And then if you look regionally, even more. I think they just surpassed Boeing recently as the largest employer in Washington state. So they have a huge presence. In Seattle, they own something like over 20% of prime office space. So in a way, Seattle feels like a company town. They're just this kind of huge presence. And what that's led to, especially over the past decade, is a lot of growth pains. And this is something that we see in other cities like San Francisco that have a lot of big tech growth. But basically, you have this big influx of highly paid tech workers and housing stock not being expanded to keep up with that. That leads to gentrification and displacement. That leads to skyrocketing rents. That leads to homelessness. That leads to stresses on the transportation system. So you have all of these kind of urban crises that are springing up in part due to the growth of Amazon in Seattle. So there's an obvious answer to this, which is to tax big tech, tax Amazon. Let's take some of that wealth and let's put it toward affordable housing. Let's put it toward a better transportation system. Let's put it toward shelter and services to try to solve the homelessness crisis. So that's kind of what a grassroots coalition in Seattle set out to do. And we found that it's easier said than done. So back in 2017, this coalition called Housing for All came together. And the Transit Riders Union, the organization I work with, was part of convening that coalition. And we pressured our city council, which had a progressive majority, starting in kind of fall of 2017. And they responded. And so by the spring of 2018, we had a piece of legislation that was going to tax big business and raise around $75 million for housing and homelessness. Now, it was contentious. There was, opposition, but we kind of thought that we were going to pull it off. And then on May 2nd, Amazon pulled a power move. All of a sudden, it was in the news, not just locally, but around the country, that Amazon had said that they were going to stop construction on a big tower they were building in downtown Seattle. And they were going to reconsider their plans to grow in Seattle until they saw what the outcome of the vote on this tax was. Now, this really just changed the conversation overnight. There was a lot of fear in Seattle. Maybe Amazon will leave us. This was also, around the time that Amazon was in the middle of their HQ2 search, so it kind of turned public opinion against the tax. Another thing that it did was it split the labor movement. So we had a lot of the labor movement really on board with this tax, but when Amazon said that they were going to stop construction on the tower, the building trades unions, which were involved in building that tower, they were suddenly against the tax. So there was this big kind of wedge in the support for this measure. And eventually what happened in June of that year was that a compromise passed. And there had been a bunch of negotiations, and the city council and the mayor thought that Amazon was on board with this compromise. It was a smaller measure, around $47 million. It passed, and then immediately it turned out they weren't on board. And the whole big business groups, including Amazon, immediately funded a referendum campaign where they were going to pay signature gatherers to go out, gather signatures, and bump the measure to a public vote. So at this point, the council freaked out, and they ended up basically repealing the measure less than a month after it passed. So this ended in a pretty big defeat for our side. But the story's not over, so now I'm going to bring it up to date. So fast forward to 2019, we had city council elections. And I think at that point, Amazon and the big business lobby groups, they saw blood in the water. They thought, now's the time. We can get all these guys out of office, and we can install more business-friendly politicians. And they dumped an enormous amount of money into our local elections. Amazon, with great fanfare, donated $1.5 million. The Chamber of Commerce, overall, it was over $4 million that they put into the elections, very visibly. They didn't make a secret about it. Now that backfired. It turns out that voters don't like big business to tell them who to vote for. And so what ended up happening in those elections was that in 6 out of the 7 races, the candidate more to the left ended up winning. And so that really kind of created almost a mandate to go forward and tax big business. And so that was kind of the situation as we were going into 2020. What happened then, we tried pretty hard to bring together kind of a community labor coalition to run a campaign for a business tax. That didn't happen. What came together instead was more of a left-wing coalition that we were also part of around our socialist council member, Shama Sawant. And so that campaign was basically gathering signatures to put a big business tax on the ballot in 2020. Well, then, of course, COVID hit, and that made things a lot more difficult. However, COVID also opened up a big political opportunity, right? Because suddenly, the whole country, the whole world had been plunged into a huge recession. There was an undeniable need for more revenue. There needed to be revenue to make up for budget shortfalls, to deal with the COVID crisis, to help send people, small businesses, economic relief. And so we then began working with another of the members of the council, Teresa Mosqueda, on a big business tax to move through the council. And it ended up being called Jumpstart Seattle. And we did it. So, and this ended up being a much bigger measure as well. So instead of the 75 million that we had been fighting for in 2018, the tax that passed last year will raise between $215 and $250 million a year. And it's also, pretty carefully designed so that it basically taxes payroll that, it taxes businesses based on the payroll that they pay to employees who make over $150,000 a year. So it's really focused on the tech sector and other kind of high salary industries. And the rates are also graduated so that Amazon is going to end up paying a lot of it. I don't know exactly how much, but I wouldn't be surprised if they end up paying north of 100 million a year just from Amazon. Now, Amazon did not publicly directly oppose the measure. I think they were in a challenging place, and obviously they had a lot of fires to put out during the pandemic, and also maybe had learned the lesson that publicly opposing things doesn't always work. So that was a really big victory last year. The fight's not over. So the Chamber of Commerce is suing the city over the tax, arguing that it's illegal. So I think we're going to win that. I don't think they really have a case, but I'm sure that that this is going to go on. So I guess that's kind of where we're at, and I'll just make a few points, just because this whole saga has had a really enduring effect on Seattle politics, and that's actually kind of playing out right now in very contentious elections for mayor and 2 of our council positions. The labor split that I mentioned, where the building trades kind of sided with Amazon, and the other thing that ended up happening in 2018 is that the more progressive part of the labor movement, which had been, a little bit supportive, but also hanging back. This was really a grassroots coalition that put this forward. They ended up kind of siding with us to defend the measure, and so that split has kind of remained. And so now, for example, in the elections that are happening now, we have kind of a slate of left candidates that the left and the progressive bulk of the labor movement are supporting. And then on the other side, a slate of more right candidates that business and a few of the conservative unions are supporting. So that's kind of an interesting political dynamic that I think will continue, but we'll see. Another thing that's really changed is how Amazon and business exert their power in politics. And I think when Amazon kind of pulled their stunt in 2018, that was really, like, they had been very quiet in Seattle politics up to that point. And so that was a clumsy move. Their donations in the elections last year were a clumsy move. From things that I've read about how they've behaved elsewhere in the country, they've been pretty clumsy overall. They've not made a lot of friends. However, they're probably starting to get more sophisticated. And I think what we've seen this year in Seattle, like in our elections, is that, you know, Amazon and also the Chamber of Commerce, they've basically changed their strategy. They're not directly putting money into candidates. They're not directly endorsing candidates even. They're still spending money, but they're doing it in roundabout ways. So they're, you know, individual businesses are contributing to PACs for candidates, but they're not, as the chamber or as Amazon, saying, here's who we think you should vote for, and we're putting all this money behind it. So they're getting more sneaky about how they play in local politics. And I'm sure that they'll continue to learn and get more sophisticated. So I think that's kind of a challenge for us to make sure that we're keeping up with them and really showing people what's really going on, even if they're not being really explicit about it. I think another thing is that the Amazon is going to leave us thing has kind of continued as a kind of a tactic. And actually, I don't know, I recently listened to Brad Stone's new book about Amazon. And if he's to be believed, Jeff Bezos actually did, during the head tax thing, say, we're going to stop expanding in Seattle. Now all of our new employees, new growth in the Seattle area is going to go to Bellevue across the lake. So apparently that was a thing that he did. However, by now, I think that's pretty much out the window. There was a recent announcement that Amazon is hiring all over the region, including 12,500 new hires in Seattle. So, you know, I think the lesson that we learned is, like, don't believe Amazon and other big corporations when they tell you that a small tax is going to make them move out, right? I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into a company's decision to do business in a city like Seattle, and you know, taxes are a relatively minor part of that. But they're going to keep using that as a political weapon. And just recently, Andrew Jassy made public statements, again, casting doubt about Amazon's commitment to growing in Seattle. And so, you know, this is just something that you have to expect. It's going to come out again and again. Yeah, so I think I'll wrap up there, and we'll leave the rest for questions.
All right. Well, please join me in another round of digital applause for our panelist tonight. Fascinating work, and I second Jason's comments on you know, the amount of work you've put in, Katie, on the ground organizing. And it's just great to sort of, I mean, you know, a behemoth like Amazon needs to be taken on from all sides, and I feel like our panelists tonight, between the sort of different perspectives here, covers you know, this industry from so many different angles. There's been a spirited debate going on the discussion board about Amazon's use of surveillance. And I wonder, I'm trying to scroll all the way back to our initial observation. I guess, well, it seems like it's coming from, well, the initial comment: shouldn't companies be allowed to watch over their employees to assure the job is getting done on time with efficiency? Doesn't the tactic of surveillance over their employees also mitigate against the risk of potential ethic, policies, and laws being broken, causing harm to both company and consumer? Did anybody have a response for that? I mean, there have been some interesting responses on the discussion board.
And I've been watching the chat, and so I would like to respond a little bit to that. I really want to thank Katie again for your talk. It's really great to hear about the progress that you've made in Seattle with the work that you've done there. I want to give an example of, there's some comments in the chat about, you know, who else does the e-commerce kind of surveillance of workers? And I'll give an example that we all know. It's FedEx, right? They're using these same kinds of technologies. Everybody's using the same kinds of technologies. Target, when you go to a Target store, the scanning, direction, evaluation, and discipline process, that is happening in front of us with people at the register. But in terms of say, somebody like FedEx, at a FedEx sortation center, their rates, their quotas, I think, are something like 180 pieces per hour per worker. For Amazon, the quota is 240 pieces per hour per worker at a similar kind of sortation facility. So it's not just the surveillance, it's the surveillance plus the speed up. It's the surveillance plus the almost unachievable and intentionally unachievable rates that workers are asked to make at Amazon. So part of the pressure is, can you make the rate? They know that you're only going to make 80% of it. they very few workers will make 100% of it. It's the stress that it induces on you as a worker, the threat of being fired, that's the problematic issue. It's the fact that you can't go pee because you need to walk several football fields away from your task in order to go to the bathroom, and that will stop you from meeting rate. So those things all need to be balanced. We're not saying that surveillance isn't maybe necessary in an organization of that size, but it doesn't have to be used like a sledgehammer.
Yeah, and it puts people's bodies at risk, right? So, under that pressure, right, workers have huge choices. Maybe they'll pee in a bottle or a trash can, right, to relieve themselves. It's very dehumanizing, right? Or they have to hold it, right, for a long, which is not good. That's not good for the human body. Or you dehydrate yourself because you're worried you're going to have to pee and you can't make rate and so off, or you'll be dinged for taking too much time off task, right? And then the injury rates, right, are about double what they are in the warehouse industry as a whole. And research has further showed that those injury rates are even higher in the more automated facilities as well within Amazon. And they go up during those big consumer holiday times, the peak periods, when workers are working overtime, right? So typically, for a full-time worker, you're working a 10-hour shift. Then you have extra time. Sometimes it's mandatory extra time, right? So you're working sometimes 12 hours, right, at this very physically grueling job. And the physically grueling job isn't just the workers walking back and forth, but sometimes workers who have to stand still, right, for hour upon hour. So it's super, and it's very, very stressful, I think, as Jason pointed out as well. So I think there's also the mental stress of it all, especially if you are, supporting kids, right? You're a single mother, right? Supporting a child, you're worried if you're gonna lose your job or not, right? And, that's the stress that a lot of Amazon workers are under. And I know there was an earlier question about, well, why do workers work there then, or something like that. And a lot of the workers, there's not good alternatives, right? And particularly in the pandemic when campuses were closing down, right? So a lot of student workers, right, that used to work on campus, right, are suddenly working in the warehouse, right, in warehouse hubs like the IE where I work. And retail was shutting down, hotels were shutting down. So a lot of workers, right, have few alternatives. And then some of the workers too, that it may be that the hours are better, at Amazon, right, than say a retail job, that might just give them part-time hours, right, or may pay them even less, right? So sometimes they don't have a lot of good alternatives to choose from, and there's been research sort of looking at where are Amazon warehouses being cited. That's actually coming out. I hear Consumer Reports is working on this research, so I'm really interested. But typically, and my hunch is that you see more warehouses in areas that are economically more depressed, right, where unemployment, underemployment tends to be higher and more concentrated, right? Often communities of color as well. So often there aren't better alternatives for many workers, unfortunately.
Yeah, and if I may, just to kind of continue on what folks have been talking about, I'm always kind of perplexed in kind of how our culture tends to, immediately try to defend a corporation as opposed to a human being who is enduring a lot of injustices and indignities. When I was riding around Los Angeles, being trained to deliver packages and listening to workers' stories and these delivery drivers. I remember one worker in particular, his name was Miguel. Miguel worked in fast food for a number of years, and Miguel was undocumented and was trying to survive in Los Angeles, a very expensive city, similar to Seattle, probably not as expensive as Seattle, but and at one point he brought up, just how unfair it felt that he was being watched by Amazon, the parent company. He's being watched by the customer, the Prime member, and by his trucking company. And it made him rush and run. He talked about how he hurt himself because of the surveillance, and he has no insurance. So we live in a society in which here in the United States, folks don't have insurance, right? Amazon's not footing that bill. And so meanwhile, in the little over an hour that we've been on this call, it was published that Jeff Bezos earns about $9 million in an hour, right? And so if you earn $15 an hour to earn that amount of money, you would have to work 24 hours a day for 60 plus years of your life, right? And that is a system that we are going to first try to defend. It's a really interesting thing. So maybe we can talk about ethics and philosophy later, but I just find that interesting.
This actually reminds me, one of our first guests of our first seminar series, we had Emily Gundelsberger Zoom in. She wrote that the book On the Clock, sort of a Barbara Ehrenreich-esque piece of immersive journalism. She wasn't she realized early into her time at Amazon that these weren't jobs that people were meant to keep, and that sort of part of the exploitation was the idea that you're just sort of a disposable individual, who will work until you basically can't work anymore, and then punch out. She noticed one of the anecdotes at the beginning of her book was when she went to the break room, next to the soda machine, they had a pill dispenser dispensing painkillers, Tylenol, hardcore Tylenols, and yeah, I mean these workers are treated so disposably, and yet coming out of a pandemic, they were also simultaneously heralded as sort of essential workers. So there's this amazing kind of contradiction of capitalism there, where it's like our most valuable workers are often sort of valued the least in the system. I was really surprised, Jake. I didn't know that those last mile delivery workers who are driving in Amazon vans, wearing Amazon vests, often technically aren't Amazon employees. And it feels like, that definitely skews in a certain direction, concerning racialized capitalism. And it's just really fascinating that this industry's gotten so big here in America.
Yes. And again, that's very intentional, right? One, it is a massive assault on existing unions in that sector, right? So you have, the Teamsters or have organized UPS, where if you look at a UPS driver versus an Amazon delivery driver who actually doesn't work for Amazon, but we think they do, if you include benefits and a higher wage, it's about double what this, I would say, misclassified Amazon delivery driver would make. But I think to your point, Alex, and I think the key term here is disposability, right? So with this Amazon capitalist model that is grounded in racial capitalism, blue collar workers of color in particular are disposable, right? That they we call this the high churn system, where they're used up, spit out, and also the communities, like folks in Seattle who are working class and poor, are disposable. Meanwhile, Amazon is subsidized, right? And also the communities who live around these warehousing complexes, these ports, that these giant shippers like Amazon and Walmart are making record profits, while communities are ingesting these toxins and are having no investment whatsoever.
I'd like to add a little bit to the conversation on the delivery drivers. In the case of the warehouse workers, frequently you get bonuses, sign-on bonuses. There are all sorts of incentives in terms of the wages being higher than other local employers. All of these things, they make it look really attractive. So workers go in with this assumption that they're going to make money. But as some folks have mentioned in the chat, there isn't actually a lot of opportunity to move up through the ranks. It's pretty limited. And the average tenure at Amazon is 18 months for workers from web services and development to workers in the warehouses. So you may get those incentives, but they pay insurance for a lot of those workers as well. But over time, the work is not worth continuing to work there, and that's part of the plan. It's to increase that churn and to get people in and out, so they don't have to take care of them over the long term or deal with wage increases for long-term workers.
And it seems like Amazon's gone on a real charm offensive as of, the last 6 months or so. I've noticed, in terms of advertising, as wages have gone up, they've tried to sort of position themselves as I just think there's this great contradiction between Amazon, the forward-facing company, and then what actually happens behind the scenes. I was curious, Katie, we had Chuck Keeney on 2 weeks ago to talk about his work, sort of fighting to preserve the Battle of Blair Mountain battlefield, and he'd mentioned something that you mentioned in your chapter about kind of the fight to control the narrative, right? And it seems like, that was something that in 2017, in that initial push, you know, Amazon was able to sort of take control of the narrative. I mean, gee, they own, the Washington Post. It's no wonder. I'm just wondering how, how do you combat, sort of a hegemonic industry that is so, thoroughly integrated into our lives, and sort of wrest away their narrative control for, in advance of policies that would help sort of everyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. And that was actually one of the things that surprised me in 2018, like when the news came out that they were, pausing construction. I thought, oh, people aren't going to fall for that. But it was instructive seeing just how much that did change the narrative and kind of embolden, opponents of the tax, and frighten the council members. So yeah, I mean, that kind of control of the narrative, I think, the narrative also that was born at that moment was, partly about kind of the danger of Amazon leaving, but it was also casting in a certain light this actually very small step that this progressive majority on the city council was taking to change our regressive tax system, right? And so instead of, our narrative was that like, okay, this is the first very, very small step in changing this really systemic issue. But the narrative that caught on was, oh, there are these irresponsible, radicals on the city council that are just going to like kill business in Seattle, and they need to be stopped, right? And that narrative has carried over into our elections going on right now. And that's kind of the story that the more right-leaning candidates' campaigns and the businesses are telling about our city council and all the horrible radical things that they're doing and how they're responsible for the homelessness crisis and this and that. So yeah, I mean, there's no simple answer, but I think it's just about telling our own story, which is also compelling. I mean, Amazon's a great villain. If you can make that story take hold, but it's challenging in Seattle where they're so dominant, just because everyone knows people who work for Amazon, and so there is this real sense of kind of dependence. On the other hand, they've cried wolf a number of times about stopping their expansion here. That's obviously not going to happen. They're very, very invested here. So anyway, that's kind of a muddy answer, but just to say it's not an easy thing, but it's certainly, I mean, it takes organizing, right? And this is part of what we learned in 2018 is like, we just don't, you need to get out there and talk to lots and lots of people and get people engaged in the political process and thinking about what's going on. Because if people are getting their information from the Seattle Times, which is our main paper, and its editorial wing is very, very pro business, then that's a problem. So it's really about how do we reach people and how do we make sure that our story is the one that they're hearing, not Amazon's story.
Yeah, and it also just kind of reveals the degree to which, Seattle's economy is tied up with one corporation. And, I mean, we've been down this road before with Boeing.
Well, and that's actually a really good point. And I think, it's a hard, I mean, there's a strong and intuitive argument to be made that that's just bad, right? Like you want a more diversified economy. Why you don't want to be dependent on one corporation. But there's this very, and you don't even necessarily want growth at this level, right? I mean, this growth is what's contributing to homelessness and rising rents. And so it's like, can we just cool it a little bit? But that's a very hard story to tell. There's just this very like growth, jobs, always good kind of mindset that is overwhelming in among the political class, at least. And it would be kind of heresy to suggest that like, maybe it's okay if Amazon doesn't grow here anymore.
it's hard to get all that on a bumper sticker, but it's the truth, right? You know? I see Charles in the chat room mentioned Kim Moody and organizing logistics hubs, and I know Jake that's something you have quite a bit of experience with in terms of scholarship. Can you walk us through this response here?
Yeah, sure. First, I will say anything I've learned from my mentor Edna Bonasic from UCR, about logistics and choke points. And yes, and Kim Moody's chapter in the book really looks at the vulnerability of time in our just-in-time global economy. And so just outside my window, you can't see, but I'm very close to the harbor here in Long Beach. And outside my window, I could actually see a ship. There are 60 ships backlogged right now because we have a disruption in the global supply chain, right? And so that's what we call a choke point, right? In global logistics, that these nodes and in the Inland Empire regions, another choke point. And I think the warehousing cluster outside Seattle is another choke point. Where you have a massive volume of goods going through one small area, or the Port of Tacoma, right? That when organized can be strategic sites to build worker power, right? And I mentioned in the chat, the ILWU, right, has defied what happened to most logistics workers around the world, although they're under constant threat by employers, right? They organized the entire West Coast to prevent employers from going to another non-union port, and that gave them leverage. So they understand the concept of choke points, as do the Teamsters, and other unions have been doing this for a long time. But yes, there's a lot of interesting work that are in labor strategists. Also in the UK, Unite the Union are looking at global choke points to organize entire industries. They're working on organizing Scotch whiskey. They've identified where in the supply chain the Scotch industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, is vulnerable for workers then to improve their working conditions, to uplift working families within those sectors, right? And so I think time is of the essence. So everything is just in time, and we now know that going through the pandemic, when we were short on PPE, the early part of the pandemic, that's because of our just-in-time economy. We no longer have we don't store goods anymore and stockpile goods. It's all delivered as needed, and that's just in time. So that is a very vulnerable part of our global supply chain.
Excellent. We had Peter Cole joined us last year to talk about the ILWU and just the organizing they've done to anti-apartheid work. Just incredibly. Thank God they're there in our ports, because they are among the most radical unionists in the country. I think we've got time for one more question. Can everybody hang out for like 5 more minutes? I don't think I've ever had so many people on a Zoom call on a panel, but we might as well conclude with the conclusion. I wanted to read the quote that you all used to introduce this conclusion, because I think it's really important, and just kind of hear a little elaboration on it. So this is from Christy Hoffman, who writes, "The fight against Amazon isn't just about one company. It's a fight for the soul of our democracy and the future of our economy. Will it work for the richest man in the world, or will it work for all of us? I believe that we will prevail if we stick together." Can you all just give me a little more, kind of panning back from Amazon itself, and thinking about kind of this as within this sort of Amazon or Striketober wave we're witnessing right now, how this is more than a fight for, a more equitable workplace, and about something much larger.
Well, I think it's a fight for our democracy. And I think Katie Wilson, her presentation was really bringing that home, right? And I think gives us some hope, right? That fight can be won, even when you're facing major challenges and setbacks, right? I think it's a larger fight for justice, right? In many different ways, right? So I think we've touched on various of these issues, but it's a fight for racial justice, for immigrant justice as well. All right, and I think we had sort of talked about the importance of surveillance, which is happening every day among these workers, right, that are delivering goods and working in the warehouses, but that surveillance is also happening in our communities too, right? And the surveillance technology, right, that Amazon is providing and has been given many contracts, right, with police departments around the nation, right, with ICE, right, with the federal government, right, as well. So I think it is a big, larger fight for justice and democracy, and a more sustainable kinds of economy as well. I think when you've got warehouses concentrated in communities, you have high levels of air pollution, and we really see that especially in the Inland Empire region. Like you just look out and much of the year you can't even see the mountains surrounding it. I mean, it's just really so bad, and that has public health effects, right? So I think so I think there's so many issues that Amazon is bringing up, and impacting us, and I think one of the major arguments that we were making, and I think many of our contributors were making, is that this is a strategic battle, right? That's a strategic site, to come together and fight for our future.
Excellent. I mean, I can't think of a better book to start with in terms of sort of orienting your approach to this fight. As I said at the beginning, I love the idea of this pivotal moment that demands naming, interrogating, and resisting. And before we can resist, we need to sort of identify what exactly it is we're fighting about. And because I think the surveillance it's us. It's not just the people in the fulfillment centers, right? Every time we access that website, we're leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs that further contributes to this machine. Well, this was absolutely fantastic. I just can't thank you all enough for joining us tonight. I cannot recommend this book enough. If you all, the holiday season is right around the corner. Whatever you do, do not purchase it on Amazon. Sure, but this was absolutely fantastic. I look forward to checking in on your work as it develops. Especially, Katie, I'm excited. I'm going to pay more attention to Seattle politics now.
A wild ride.
Well, excellent. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Next week, we're going to be right back here at 6 p.m. on Wednesday. We've got Helena Worthen, who's going to be sharing her work on organizing in higher ed. So very topical. I'm sure some of the panelists might be interested in tuning in for that one. She just published a book called Power Despite Precarity. Very good. Excellent. Well, thanks again. And panelists, I will definitely be in touch tomorrow or the day after to follow up. But thank you again so much. This is really great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for organizing this and inviting us. And yeah, it's been great to come together and the spirited debate that's happening. I really have been enjoying the chats, and I wish we'd had heard some more of your voices. But I love just reading what folks had to say about the issues, and that you're thinking critically about these things. So. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Excellent. All right.